You're listening to the Future Tech Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies such as artificial intelligence, stem cells, 3D printing, gene editing, Bitcoin, blockchain, the microbiome, quantum computing, virtual reality, and exploring space are much closer than you might think. In fact, many early versions of these technologies are in play right now, and the companies that are using these technologies are the focus of this podcast. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a thorny medical problem. Remember, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and tell your friends about it. Thank you. Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Future Tech Podcast. I have Sönke Ahrens. He's the author of a book, Take Smart Notes. Website is takesmartnotes.com. You would think that taking notes would be boring. And I remember my wife, this book was on our counter, and my wife had ordered it, and I picked it up and started reading it, and it was super interesting. So I wanted to get in touch with Sönke and talk to him, and that's why he's here. So Sönke, thanks for coming.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So tell me, why write a book on taking notes? Where does all where did this idea stem from?
Well, in the beginning, it was really a practical question for myself while I was writing my Ph.D. thesis. And as many students, when they deal with a lot of information, many have the same problems. Where do I store the things? How do I remember what I'm reading? And the obvious answer is, well, you take notes. But then you have the next question. So where do you store the notes so you can find them again? And as I'm working in the field of education and learning, and I'm interested in the way technology and thinking interconnects, I have the luxury of turning this very practical, personal curiosity. How do I do that in the best possible way into a kind of research question? And I'm really surprised that so many different interesting questions kind of come together in the very practical, seemingly banal question of, well, how do I take notes? So that really brought me to writing the book, just to provide others the ideas and the experience I had, so others don't have to go through all the trial and errors and can go straight ahead. Yeah.
And I guess behind the book is this legendary character. I don't have his name on the tip of my tongue, but he was like a master note taker and writer. Can you talk about this person?
Sure. That's Niklas Luhmann. He is actually not that well known in the English-speaking world. He is very well known in sociology and in Germany and other parts in the world as well. What's interesting about him is not just his theory. So he had this grand theory about society. It's rooted in systems theory. And in the beginning, I was more interested in his theoretical work. And it's quite challenging. It's very complex. And it's very interdisciplinary. So he writes about not only sociology, but from a sociological standpoint about all aspects of society, like art and economics and politics, you name it. And later I discovered that the reason he was able to write such dense text with such a complexity was only possible because he strategically externalized his thinking on paper. And a kind of side effect, really more, is this enormous productivity. So he started actually as someone who is not working in academia. He was working in law, and after his 9-to-5 job, he just read a lot, like many people do, but also took a lot of notes. And he collected the notes in a particular way that enabled him to spark new ideas from just combining old ideas. And in a very short time, he put a couple of books out, get them published, got a professorship in sociology, which wasn't his original field. And then there's this famous question in the beginning in Germany when you start as a professor. So what's your project? And his answer is, well, theory of society, duration 30 years, cost none. And actually 20 and a half and 29 and a half years later, he published the last chapter of this book. And in the meantime, in these 30 years, he published in total about 60 books on a huge variety of topics, hundreds of articles. And in a superficial way, the first thing you get attracted to is, of course, this kind of productivity. And the question is, well, how can I get slightly more productive by copying the technique he used? Because whenever he was asked, how on earth are you able to have this kind of output, which is not repetitive, but very dense in insight, his answer was always, well, I do that with my Zettelkasten. So his note-taking system. I'm not doing that alone. Most of it happens just outside on paper. And I think most years people haven't really appreciated that this is really the reason for his productivity, because we are very prone to this idea that someone who accomplishes a lot has to be a genius. And it's much more mundane to say, well, he's probably very smart too. But the mundane task of writing down what you think, sorting it in a particular way, that is actually something that makes all the difference. And I think nowadays we have a much better understanding how this kind of externalizing really is not just a help for thinking, but more like a necessity to really accomplish something.
So what are some of the things that, the book mentions a Slipbox, but there's no picture of it. But, what are some of the crucial elements of being able to be more effective at taking notes?
Yeah, well, I'm speaking about the Slipbox, but I discovered that it really started that people speak about the Zettelkasten and use the German word. So maybe I just switch to that. And
called in German again?
Zettelkasten. So it's literally the translation is a box of index cards. And that is what it's basically is. So the technique obviously is independent of the material you use. There are software apps available, but he used pen and paper in an index card format. And he started to write on normal paper and didn't use the classic index cards out of cardboard or this slightly heavier paper, because he realized he will write a lot, and whenever he can save some space by using thinner paper, that is probably helpful. So in the end, it's what you find in libraries, these kind of furniture index card shelves, and they are all written in the on the same format, always have a fixed ID on the top left, which is important because he did not sort his notes by topic. So that is something we tend to do intuitively, that we have some categories in mind. And our first question is, well, I've written something down, where can I store it? And the more important question is not where can I store something, but where can I retrieve it? Where do I want to, in which kind of context do I want to stumble upon something and be reminded of something I might have forgotten long ago? So he would start with writing his first note and give it the ID number 1, and the second one number 2, and 3 and 4, and so on. The interesting part begins when he now adds ideas to already existing ideas and makes connections. So then he's starting to branch out and would put a new note behind number 1, which he would then call number 1A. So by swapping between numbers and letters, he could indefinitely branch out, and topics then would emerge bottom up. So the categories are not hardwired into the system. He would then rather give himself an overview over a topic by writing a new note, because the way we structure a topic or the way we think about categories are changing over time. And the problem with many systems which are more built like an archive are that they hardwire the initial idea about how we want to approach something into the system and make it very difficult to change that later. So that is interesting for me, for the question, how can we write in a way that makes it easier for ourselves to change our mind about something? And I think that's where the question, what kind of technology do I use? What kind of system do I use really comes into play. Yeah.
So what's a subject that you know really well, so we can do a comparison of how would someone normally make a few notes on this subject and then how you would do it with this different system? Is there an easy example that you can talk about?
I mean, I can... The question how to change our minds, how to be open-minded, that is something that I'm working on at the moment, to put it very plainly. But I can describe how I approach writing in general, because I think that makes it slightly more feasible how it's different. So whenever I read something, I always already have in mind some kind of question and I'm working on, and would write a few notes, just scribble down what I want to remember from the text. And that is not the main part. So that is just collecting some stuff I'm encountering. The interesting bit is the second step. And that is actually something that many people already don't do. So many people just underline sentence, highlight sentences, maybe write a short excerpt, but don't do the second step. And that is, well, what does it mean? I've encountered this great idea that, for example, technology is relevant for our thinking, but that is kind of abstract until we do something with it. And to do something with it means, in this context, to look through all the old notes. Where can I connect this thought with? And in the beginning, of course, when you only have a few notes, it's more like a collection. But very quickly, a couple of hundred notes, you start seeing connections, building connections. And then you're reminded of something you have written maybe a couple of months before on a similar subject. And if we would just think about it in our head, our mind plays tricks with us. So if our mind sees a resemblance, it will make it appear the same. But when we have written it down and compare an actual note we have written a couple of months ago with the new one we are writing now, we are forced to compare the differences. And that is one of the main features that this kind of externalized memory can't be cheated in the same way we cheat ourselves constantly when we remember something in our mind. So then I would write the new note in explicit comparison to the old one, maybe extend on an idea, maybe notice a contradiction and would write that down. So it's like an ongoing dialogue with your old self, which is constantly developing. And that means you spend a lot of time looking at old stuff, retrieving it again, and thinking about how to make a connection between these two things. And interestingly, these are exactly the things learning theory teaches us we should do when we want to remember something. Retrieving old memories, elaborating on them, and actually putting them into our own words. So that means it feels much slower when you go through the things you read and put them into your own words and connect them with your own thoughts. But in the end, it's so much more efficient because you embed them in the continuous stream of your own thinking and embed them much deeper in your memory. So in a slightly counterintuitive way, I think it's the much more efficient way to approach new information.
So give me an example of either you or someone you know, a project they worked on. Where were they at before they learned the system, and how was it different for them after the system?
Well, most people I talk to, so sometimes I coach people to set up their own Zettelkasten or file system. And interestingly, most of them are not from academia, which is what the book was aimed at in the beginning. I think that is because people from medicine, business, and other fields are really interested in storing what they're reading because it's not about collecting. It's about how do I bring the new information I gather to my own attention when I need that. So those who are very outcome orientated, I think, have an attraction to that. And they often struggle with finding a coherent system to write notes down. So many tinker a lot with different formats. So they use a journal and write down all the thoughts they had within a day, which is great, but it's not perfect because it's sorted in a chronological order, and you have you have difficulties to find what you have written. And others use software apps like Evernote or Google Keep or some Markdown app. And they have their own restrictions too. And interestingly, most of them are forcing you to hardwire some categories. So the change is usually not so much about setting the Zettelkasten in exactly the way Luhmann did it up, but about thinking differently about note-taking itself and thinking about what works for them. So they think more about making connections and writing it down in a way that the first thought is always, well, where do I want to stumble upon that when I have already forgotten what I've written down? And the difference it makes is for most of them, first of all, getting into a routine of writing more and rephrasing ideas in their own words, which in itself is the best technique for understanding. And the experience is often, well, only in the moment I'm really trying to put it into my own words, I realize I haven't really fully understood what I was reading here. So that is usually the first and most obvious effect. And the second one is that a coherent system where you only have one kind of permanent notes. It doesn't really matter what kind of scribble notes you take, whatever works best. But if you make a decision on, well, everything that is long-term, everything that I want to keep forever, where I have projects which are not finished and done in a month, but continue for longer. If you then decide on a particular format, you enable yourself to build up a routine. And I think that's the most lasting effect, that you stop thinking so much about where do I write this down? How do I write this down? Because all these things are decided once and for all. I always write it down on this piece of paper or in this application, never longer than a paragraph. And I always keep it in the same space. And I always go through the same steps of looking for connections, writing it down, and storing it. Because if you don't have this kind of standardized way of writing things down, it's almost impossible to turn that into a daily routine. And most people I spoke to are really looking for something where they don't have to think anymore about where to put stuff, but which can be integrated into their everyday routine, usually in the evening. Yeah.
Well, beyond wearing, what are some of the mechanics of this? Beyond, let's say I'm taking notes on various literature. I end up with 500 index cards of notes. What would a typical person do in an attempt to synthesize them into a book or a thesis about what I'm studying versus the Zettelkasten system?
Sure. So I think the first thing to keep in mind is that you separate a couple of steps. And the first one is really this gathering of information, either if you encounter something during your day or in a lecture or during a talk, or you're reading something that is very similar to David Allen's GTD approach, that the first step is just collecting stuff. And the second step is to process it. The difference to David Allen is that his approach works very well to projects where you have a definite outcome and you don't want to lose sight where you're heading. When you are looking for insight or working in research, you don't know what you're looking for, because that's the definition of insight, something you cannot foresee. Otherwise, you would already know it. So the second step is slightly different. And the what I do is before I write a new note, I look through my Zettelkasten, write down a couple of numbers where it might connect to, decide on the one it connects most obviously to, and then write it directly in response to that. So over time, something builds up, and I see where cluster builds, and this is usually where I then decide, well, I can turn that into a lecture, or I can turn that into an article. And then you swap to the third step, and that is, well, you have to outline the manuscript, whatever that is for. And that is a different mindset. Working on a manuscript is a different mindset than working within the Slipbox and developing ideas, because then you have to decide what is this about, how do I want to structure that? You have to put it in a linear order. And the good thing now is you don't start from scratch anymore, because you already have built up a resource of materials and notes you can immediately use to reshuffle them into something that could work as the outline of an article or a manuscript. And it immediately shows you where the gaps are, where you have to strengthen an argument, where you have to work on contradictions. And then it's really the classic way of how you deal with an argument, a manuscript. You have to get a first rough draft out that is definitely not perfect, so you can go to the next step, and that is looking at it with the eyes of the reader, and then rewriting it, because that's where usually most people spend most of the time on, and that is rewriting non-perfect draft. Does this give you an idea about how to approach it?
Well, again, mechanistically, like, how would you do all this? You know, I imagine myself sitting there again with a whole bunch of note cards. I would think most people get lost at this point and maybe just start looking through the note cards and thinking, you know, what am I going to do with all this stuff? So is there a system within Zettelkasten that shows you how to look at, you know, it sounds like you've categorized them, quote unquote, properly first, right, but still you're sitting there with a whole heap of them. How do you now process them and look for connections and know which right ones to match to which, and how to put them back in the box and all that stuff?
Yeah. Well, it might sound a little bit more simple than it actually is, because the idea is quite easy. It's simple, but it's not so easy to get into a routine and to actually do it. So one thing I've left out is you have to have an index. You have to have an alphabetical index that gives you an overview where things are, because the notes are not sorted by categories. Therefore, you have to give yourself an overview in a different way. And the simplest is just keeping an index. So Luhmann had an alphabetical index where he would just point to particular notes which are like entry notes into a cluster to that particular topic or a concept or a theory. Usually when the Zettelkasten has a kind of feedback loop that gives you feedback when you need something else. So in the beginning, you won't have any trouble because you only have a few notes and you know where they are. You might track them in the index, but after a while, you kind of lose the idea where things are. So when you see there's a cluster building on a particular topic, like learning, then I would write a new note that gives me an overview. So that would be a note with links to all the relevant notes to that particular topic in already a structured way. And I can later replace that. But for the moment, that would be the entry note, which I refer to from the index. And the second very pragmatic thing is when I work on projects, I also have particular notes which are entries into that. So on these notes, I link to the relevant topics within the Zettelkasten I might use. So when I then start with the manuscript, I would start with the structure which is written on these kind of overview notes. So that is the main way of keeping track where you store things. But it would be a misunderstanding to think that it is about having an overview over everything you have in there, because we don't have an overview over everything we know either. It's more about getting as quickly as possible into the topics on the content level where we can continue the thought and pick up where we left it the last time. So that is really the main idea about these index.
So what do you want your role to be in Zettelkasten? Are you going to be you've written about it. Are you going to be a big promoter of it? Are you going to be selling Zettelkasten boxes, or what do you want your role to be?
Well, the main idea really was to have something I can give to my students, because I see them struggle with notes, and I can relate to that because I struggled a lot and used a lot of different systems. And I know what a difference it makes not to have to think about where do I put stuff and where can I find it. And it gets you much quicker to what's really relevant, and that is the content itself. So that was the main purpose. I do offer coaching for people who want to get into it or explain it differently, and I also would like to see that better software apps will be available, because we have a lot of tinkering going on at the moment. So the idea is very well received, and it's obvious that there is a huge need for this kind of system where you can collect ideas in a non-linear way. But it's obvious, even though it's obvious that this is something that can be easily emulated in a software application, there is nothing yet that completely convinces me. So there's one which I link to from my website, which I use myself. I'm happy with it, but it's in the end a one-man project, and I would like to see an open source project coming up, which will be developed further. And I don't think that can be turned into regular business, because it has to be open source. When you entrust your thinking and your writing to a system which ideally works for the very long haul, ideally for life, you can't make yourself dependent on a company that might get out of business. So I think it needs to be open source, and I hope that we can set up something in the near future where people can build upon. Yeah, that's the next idea.
Have you made little Zettelkasten slip note boxes, or do your students ever make them? Have you found that that's useful? To have more physical components to it instead of an app, or do you think an app is more the way to go?
I think it depends a little bit on what your preferences are. I started with paper and I swapped to a digital one, but that's mainly because I travel a lot and I want to have it with me. I'm surprised and intrigued by the fact that a lot of people prefer pen and paper who are working in software development. So I would say it's almost 50-50 who's working with pen and paper or who's preferring a software app. But I think those, or from my observation, which is not empirical research, but I have the feeling those who work professionally with software prefer pen and paper much more often.
It's interesting that the physical is so important with stuff like this,
And many people have a kind of routine, and by writing things down, it slows the thinking down. It has a physicality to it. Software can't emulate. I totally get that. And when I do quick notes, I always have pen and paper with me. I don't think that can be replaced completely. But on the other hand, having a software you can do a full text search, have everything available all the time, that is hard to beat too. So that their papers are slightly more clumsy.
Maybe there would be a hybrid where you take notes physically. The software component helps you do searches on different thoughts and different themes. It connects things, and then you could always, incorporate that and partner with the physical on it.
Yeah, I think that would be the way to go. It's a little bit in the future, but obviously, I think this strong difference will soon be something of the past. Yeah, I'm sure that's true. That a combination of both will be the standard way to go. Yeah.
Okay. Well, very good. Well, Sönke, can you restate the name of your book and tell people where it is? And then if they want to, ask you about coaching, how can they contact you?
Sure. So the book is called How to Take Smart Notes and available on usual bookstores, and more information also to the software. And if you want to get in contact with me, it's the website takesmartnotes.com.
Okay, very good. And people can, get in touch for everything for you in that place. Okay, excellent. Okay. Well, Sönke, thank you for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me again. Yeah, great.
You're listening to the Future Tech Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies such as artificial intelligence, stem cells, 3D printing, gene editing, Bitcoin, blockchain, the microbiome, quantum computing, virtual reality, and exploring space are much closer than you might think. In fact, many early versions of these technologies are in play right now, and the companies that are using these technologies are the focus of this podcast. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a thorny medical problem. Remember, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and tell your friends about it. Thank you.